It was a Tuesday evening in October, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of tea that had gone cold about 20 minutes earlier. The apartment was quiet in the way it gets on weekday nights when there is nothing specific happening and nowhere specific to be. The overhead light in the kitchen was slightly too bright for the mood of the room, but I had never gotten around to replacing the bulb with something warmer, and that felt about right for the kind of evening it was. I had just transferred $800 to my brother. I sat there looking at the remaining balance on the screen. $214. The number was not shocking in the way that numbers sometimes are. It was just the way a fact is just there when you have been quietly building toward it for long enough that its arrival feels less like a surprise and more like a confirmation. My electricity bill was due in 4 days. I did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way you do when the math has become a reflex. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. Not because it makes me stronger, but because it is accurate. I closed the laptop and sat with my hands in my lap and looked at the middle distance for a while. The refrigerator made its small mechanical sound. Somewhere outside a car passed. The tea was cold. This was the third consecutive month I had sent that amount. It had not started at $800. It had started smaller, the way these things always start smaller. At a number that felt manageable and temporary and like the obvious thing to do when someone you love needs help and you happen to have it. I have since read that 76% of Americans believe adult family members have a moral responsibility to provide financial support to one another when it is needed. I was not aware of that statistic at the time, but I did not need to be. I had absorbed the belief the way most people absorb it, not from a survey, but from years of watching what family was supposed to mean and deciding, without ever quite deciding, to become someone who lived up to it. This is not a story about a bad family. I want to say that clearly at the beginning before anything else. The people involved are not villains. They are just people, which is sometimes the more complicated thing to reckon with. This is a story about how long it can take to notice that you have been slowly confusing love with the willingness to disappear into it. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of tea that had gone cold about 20 minutes earlier. The apartment was quiet in the way it gets on weekday nights when there is nothing specific happening and nowhere specific to be. The overhead light in the kitchen was slightly too bright for the mood of the room, but I had never gotten around to replacing the bulb with something warmer, and that felt about right for the kind of evening it was. I had just transferred $800 to my brother. I sat there looking at the remaining balance on the screen. $214. The number was not shocking in the way that numbers sometimes are. It was just the way a fact is just there when you have been quietly building toward it for long enough that its arrival feels less like a surprise and more like a confirmation. My electricity bill was due in 4 days. I did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way you do when the math has become a reflex. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, not because it makes me stronger, but because it is accurate. I closed the laptop and sat with my hands in my lap and looked at the middle distance for a while. The refrigerator made its small mechanical sound. Somewhere outside a car passed. The tea was cold. This was the third consecutive month I had sent that amount. It had not started at $800. It had started smaller, the way these things always start smaller. At a number that felt manageable and temporary and like the obvious thing to do when someone you love needs help and you happen to have it. I have since read that 76% of Americans believe adult family members have a moral responsibility to provide financial support to one another when it is needed. I was not aware of that statistic at the time, but I did not need to be. I had absorbed the belief the way most people absorb it, not from a survey, but from years of watching what family was supposed to mean and deciding, without ever quite deciding, to become someone who lived up to it. This is not a story about a bad family. I want to say that clearly at the beginning before anything else. The people involved are not villains. They are just people, which is sometimes the more complicated thing to reckon with. This is a story about how long it can take to notice that you have been slowly confusing love with the willingness to disappear into it. In 2019, I was 31 years old and living in a mid-sized city in a one-bedroom apartment I was genuinely proud of. I had a project management role at a mid-sized logistics company that paid $67,000 a year, which was not wealth by any measure but was stability. And stability was something I had worked carefully toward and did not take lightly. I paid my bills on time. I had a modest savings account I added to every month without fail. I cooked at home most nights and took one trip a year and considered myself, without drama, someone who had figured out the basic architecture of a functional adult life. My brother Kyle was 27. He had been working in retail management for about 3 years when the company he worked for began restructuring and his position was eliminated. He called me on a Thursday evening and explained the situation in the matter-of-fact tone he used when he was embarrassed but trying not to show it. He needed $400 to cover his rent while he looked for something new. He said he would pay it back within 6 weeks. I transferred the money that same evening without giving it significant thought. And I want to be honest about why, because the reason matters more than the amount. It was not because I had excess. It was because he was my brother, and $400 felt like the kind of help that a decent person provides when they are able to, and someone they love is in a temporary bind. The request was specific. The need was real. The timeline felt manageable. There was nothing in that moment that felt like the beginning of anything other than a normal act of ordinary care. 3 months later, he asked again. Another $400. The job search was taking longer than expected. I sent it. I have since come across research showing that more than half of adults in the middle stages of their lives have provided financial support to a sibling or family member for basic living expenses within any given year. I was not an outlier. I was not being taken advantage of in any dramatic or obvious way. I was simply doing what a significant portion of people quietly do, absorbing someone else's financial gap because the alternative felt worse than the cost. 2020 changed the texture of things, the way it changed the texture of most things. My parents, who were both in their early 60s and still working, had their hours reduced significantly within the first few months of the pandemic. My father worked in facilities management. My mother worked part-time at a medical billing office. Between them, they lost roughly a third of their monthly income during a period when grocery prices were climbing and their fixed expenses were not. My mother mentioned it on the phone in April with a tone that was not quite asking and not quite not asking. I told her I could help with groceries for a while. I began sending $300 a month. It was framed, at the time, as temporary. That word did its usual work. It made the thing feel bounded, like a bridge between two solid pieces of ground, rather than a new kind of terrain. I told myself it would resolve when things opened back up, when their hours returned, when the particular uncertainty of that year settled into something more navigable. I believed that, sincerely. I am not sure when I stopped believing it, but the $300 continued well past the point where temporary had any honest meaning left in it. In 2021, Kyle found a new apartment. It was a slight upgrade from where he had been living. A little more space, a better neighborhood, a monthly rent his part-time income could not fully support. He asked if I would co-sign the lease. I hesitated for 2 days and then agreed, because declining felt like the kind of thing that would require an explanation I did not have the energy to construct, and because I told myself he was moving in the right direction and needed the support of someone who believed in that direction. The cosign led, naturally and without any formal conversation, to a monthly transfer of $650 to cover the gap between what he earned and what the apartment cost. It was not presented as an indefinite arrangement. It was presented, again, as a bridge. By this point, I had some facility with the particular emotional logic of bridges, which is that they are very easy to begin crossing and considerably harder to stop once you are in the middle. In the spring of 2022, my mother needed a medical procedure. It was not an emergency, but it was necessary, and the portion not covered by her insurance came to $3,200. She called and explained the situation, and I heard in her voice the particular quality of someone who hates asking and is asking anyway, and I told her not to worry about it. I covered the full amount. By the end of 2022, when I sat down and actually added the transfers across the previous 3 years, which I had deliberately avoided doing in a single calculation up until that point, the total came to just under $19,000. The number surprised me less than the fact that I had not looked at it directly before. I had been managing it in pieces, the way you manage a slow leak by keeping a towel on the floor rather than fixing the pipe. Each individual transfer had its own contained logic. Together, they told a different story. What strikes me now, looking back at that period, is not the amounts. It is the silence around them. Not one of those transfers had ever been formalized. Not one had been repaid. Not once had anyone in my family asked me directly whether I could afford what I was giving, or what it was costing me, or whether there was a version of the arrangement that worked better for all of us. They did not ask because they did not need to. The money arrived. It had always arrived. Without anyone deciding this out loud, the transfers had stopped being help and had become something else entirely. They had become part of how the household worked, part of the budget, part of the assumed monthly structure of everyone's life except, it seemed, mine. They were no longer help. They were simply expected. The first time Kyle responded to a transfer confirmation with a thumbs-up emoji, I did not think anything of it. It was a small thing. People are busy. A thumbs-up is still an acknowledgement, technically, and I was not sending money in order to receive gratitude. I was sending it because he needed it, and I had it, and that was the arrangement, even if the arrangement had never been spoken aloud in those terms. But I noticed it. I noticed it the way you notice a small change in a familiar sound. Not enough to stop what you are doing, just enough to register that something is slightly different from how it was before. A few months later, the thumbs-up stopped too. I would send the transfer, the confirmation would go through, and there would be nothing on the other end. No message, no acknowledgement, no brief text saying he had received it. The money moved, and the silence that followed was so complete that I sometimes found myself checking the transfer history just to confirm it had gone through, because the absence of any response made the whole thing feel slightly unreal. I never said anything about it. I told myself it did not matter why I was helping, only that I was, and that tying the help to a thank you would make it transactional in a way that felt ungenerous. I believed that. I also knew, somewhere below the belief, that I was using it to avoid a conversation I did not want to have. In February of 2023, my mother called on a Wednesday afternoon. I remember it was Wednesday because I had just come out of a long project meeting, and I stepped into the hallway to take the call, expecting the usual rhythm of a check-in. She asked how I was doing in the way that people ask when it is a preamble rather than a genuine question, and then she moved into the reason for the call. Prices had gone up significantly, she said. Groceries especially. She wondered if I could increase the monthly amount from $300 to $400. She was not wrong about prices. Around that time, a significant majority of American adults reported that inflation had measurably worsened their financial situation. And my parents were living that reality in concrete terms. I understood that. What I also understood, standing in that hallway, was that my own grocery bill had increased by roughly the same proportion over the same period, and that my rent had gone up at the previous lease renewal, and that my own financial situation had tightened in ways that nobody in my family had thought to ask about. The call was not unkind. My mother was not being deliberately thoughtless. She simply had not considered that the question might run in both directions. I said I would see what I could do. I increased it to $400 the following month. In May, Kyle sent a message in the family group chat saying he was thinking about getting a dog. He had found a breed he liked, had already looked into it, and mentioned in the same breath that if I could spot him a bit extra that month for the deposit, that would be helpful. It was written in the tone of someone asking for something they expect to receive. Not demanding, not apologetic, just matter-of-fact in the way that requests become matter-of-fact once asking has stopped feeling like asking. I sent the extra money. I did not respond to the message directly. I just sent it and put my phone face down on the table and sat with a feeling I did not immediately have a name for. It was not quite anger. It was something quieter and more unsettling than anger. Something closer to the feeling of suddenly seeing the shape of a room you have been standing in for a long time without ever looking at the walls. My father called in July. We did not talk often, the two of us. He was not a phone person, and our conversations tended to be pleasant and brief. Toward the end of the call, in the warm, offhand tone he used for things he meant sincerely, he said, "You have always been the steady one. We are lucky we have you." I said thank you, and we said goodbye, and I sat in my parked car in the lot outside the grocery store for a while without going in. The thing about that sentence is that it was genuinely meant. I do not doubt that. But somewhere between hearing it and sitting with it, I understood that it was not a compliment in the way compliments usually work. It was a description of a role. And roles in families, I was beginning to understand, are assigned early and maintained carefully, not through any deliberate cruelty, but through the quiet repetition of everyone behaving as though the assignment is simply accurate. Psychologists who study how money functions inside families often note that financial behaviors are learned, that the beliefs people carry about who is responsible and who needs help and what care is supposed to look like are absorbed over decades before anyone ever thinks to question them. I had been the steady one since I was a child. The role had been running without my conscious participation for 35 years. I sat in that parking lot, and for the first time, I added it all up honestly. Not just the dollar amounts, though those were part of it. I added up the years, the patterns, the calls that opened with, "How are you?" and moved quickly to the actual topic. The transfers that had stopped generating any acknowledgement at all. The ways the arrangement had expanded without any conversation about whether expansion was something I had agreed to. I did not cry. I just sat there in the quiet of the car and looked at what the numbers actually said. And I understood for the first time, with a clarity that felt less like a revelation than like finally putting on glasses I had needed for a long time, that something had been going on that I had not been fully willing to see. The 5 weeks after I sent that message were not dramatic. That is the first thing I want to say about them. There was no explosion, no confrontation, no moment where everything came to a head in a way that would have at least given the situation a clear shape. There was just quiet. And the quiet was, in its own way, the most informative thing that had happened in 4 years. Kyle contacted me twice in those 5 weeks. The first time was a text, about 10 days after my message, asking if I had found anything yet. It was 4 words. I told him I was actively looking and that I would keep everyone posted. He replied with a thumbs up. The second time was 3 weeks later, a slightly longer message explaining that his rent was coming up and asking if I had any sense of my timeline. Not "How are you holding up?" Not "Is there anything you need?" Just the rent and the timeline and the implicit question underneath both of them, which was really about when the transfers would resume. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon about 2 weeks in. I answered hoping, in a way I had not admitted to myself until the phone was ringing, that this would be the call where she asked how I was really doing. We talked for 23 minutes. She told me at length about a neighbor who had recently been diagnosed with something serious, and about a conflict at her church group, and about something she had seen on television that reminded her of our childhood. Near the end of the call, in a tone that suggested it was an afterthought rather than the reason she had called, she asked whether I had tried any of those job apps. I told her I was using several of them. She said that was good and that things had a way of working out. We said goodbye. My father did not call. I want to be careful about how I describe this period because it is easy, in retrospect, to construct a narrative where the silence was a verdict, where my family's non-response was a deliberate communication about my value to them. I do not think that is accurate. I think it is more complicated and more ordinary than that. Research on how financial stress moves through families suggests that economic strain tends to erode warmth and perceived support gradually, not through active withdrawal, but through a kind of relational contraction, where everyone becomes more focused on their own immediate situation and less available for anyone else's. My family was experiencing the removal of something they had built their stability around. They were managing that. They were not, in those 5 weeks, particularly available to also manage me. But understanding something and feeling it are not the same process. There was a Sunday, about 3 weeks in, when I ate rice and frozen vegetables for the 4th day in a row, and my phone did not ring once. Not a text, not a check-in, not a voice message from anyone in my family asking whether I had food, or whether I needed anything, or whether I was sleeping. The family group chat continued its normal rhythm around me. A photo my mother shared, a brief exchange about a cousin's new job, a funny video Kyle forwarded. My situation existed in that chat as a kind of weather system everyone was aware of and waiting to pass. I noticed the 3-dot bubbles a few times, someone beginning to type something and then not sending it. I would watch them appear and then disappear, and then I would put my phone face down on the table and look out the window for a while. What I was slowly understanding during those weeks, not in a sudden way, but in the gradual way that things become clear when the noise finally stops, was something I did not have precise language for yet. It was the difference between people who are attached to who you are and people who are attached to what you do for them. The distinction sounds simple when you say it plainly like that. It is considerably less simple when the people involved are your family, and you have spent 4 years and thousands of dollars not wanting to know which category you were in. I was beginning to know. By November 2023, I had a new job. It wasn't an upgrade, just a lateral move with the same salary, but it was steady, and that steadiness felt different from the kind I used to rely on. I didn't tell anyone at home right away. I told myself it was because I needed time to settle, but a part of me knew I was also curious about what would happen if I didn't fill in the gap for them. The first week passed quietly. I went to work, came back, arranged my small apartment in ways that made it feel more like mine. My phone stayed mostly silent. Then Kyle texted one evening, asking if things were looking up yet. The phrasing stayed vague, like he didn't want to ask directly but still expected an answer that reassured him. I typed something neutral and left it at that. A few days later, my mother mentioned during a call that grocery bills had been difficult lately. She said it casually, almost like an observation about the weather. I waited for her to ask how I was doing, or whether I'd found something stable, but she moved on to another topic. I noticed the gap more than the words themselves. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. It was more like something had finally come into focus. The questions I used to ask myself, why don't they notice? Why don't they ask? Stopped feeling urgent. It wasn't that I had answers. It was that I stopped expecting different ones. I took out the same notepad I had used months earlier, the one with the careful breakdown of my expenses and transfers. The pages still held the old logic, written in my own handwriting, as if it had been obvious at the time. I turned to a blank page and sat with it longer than I expected. The first decision came slowly, but once it formed, it felt stable. I would not resume the automatic monthly transfers. Not as a reaction, not to prove anything, but because the numbers no longer made sense for me. The second was about what I would say if it came up. I wrote it down in simple terms. I'm restructuring my finances, and I'm not in a position to return to the previous arrangement. The third decision took a bit more time. I didn't want to distance myself from them completely. I wasn't trying to withdraw from the relationship. I wrote that I would stay connected, call, visit when I could, but the financial part of that connection would be different now, permanently. The fourth was the hardest to phrase. I wrote that I would let myself feel whatever came with this, especially the part that felt like loss, without using it as a reason to undo what I had decided. I remembered reading once that people often learn how to set boundaries only after they've gone too far in the other direction. It didn't make me feel late. It just made me feel like I had finally reached the point where I could see what I was doing. That night, I drafted a message. I kept it short. I told my mother and Kyle that I was back on my feet, that I appreciated their patience, and that I wanted to be honest that my financial situation had changed in ways that would be permanent. I added that I was available to talk whenever they wanted. I read it once more before sending. It didn't feel dramatic. It just felt like something I should have understood earlier, but didn't. The responses to my message didn't arrive in any neat order. Kyle replied first. It was short, almost clipped. I get it. There was nothing else after it, no follow-up, and I remember staring at it longer than I expected to. It didn't feel like understanding. It felt like distance being politely confirmed. My mother called later that night. The conversation kept circling around itself. She would start to say something, then soften it halfway, then return to old phrasing like it was safer. I stayed calm, but I could feel how unfamiliar honesty had become between us, like neither of us fully trusted the shape of it anymore. 2 days later, my father texted. It was simple. Take care of yourself first. No explanation, no elaboration. Somehow, that made it harder to dismiss. I didn't reply immediately. I just let it sit there and exist on its own. 6 months later, in May 2024, I was sitting at the same kitchen table where everything had started to feel complicated in the first place. My laptop was open, a quiet reminder of work continuing, whether I was emotionally ready or not. I checked my account balance without much expectation anymore. It showed 11,400 and slowly growing. Nothing dramatic about it, just steady accumulation that I didn't have to undo later. The electricity bill was paid. There were no automatic transfers waiting in the background. I had booked a small weekend trip earlier that week, something I would have talked myself out of before. It didn't feel like celebration. It felt like normal life finally catching up to me instead of me chasing it. For a long time, I thought change would feel louder than this, but it didn't. It felt quiet, contained, like I had simply stopped leaving myself out of my own decisions. I realized that nothing outside me had changed in any dramatic way, but my attention no longer abandoned me in small moments throughout the day like it used to feel anymore now. I didn't feel like I had won anything, just that I had finally stopped paying for peace with myself anymore now. There was no relief in the way people imagine it, only a quiet absence of constant internal negotiation with myself ongoing still. The day I stopped sending money, I thought I was losing my family. What I actually lost was the version of myself that believed love had to be purchased to be real.